Familiar with the work crowd, we are a global freelance network, and we have freelancers across the PR, communications and marketing space. And the PRCA NextGen group, we're a national group, and we provide information, support and advice to practicing PR and communications professionals, and we specialise in graduate level up to account director. So with me today, I have three incredible speakers. I'll hand over to them to introduce themselves in a moment, but just wanted to say, if you guys have any questions at all as we go along, please do pop them in the chat or the Q&A function, as there will be time at the end, about 15 minutes for questions. So yeah, do go as we go. All right, so we'll start kicking off then, because we've got a lot to cover. I'll pass over to the speakers to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about what it is that they do. Susan, I'll come to you first.
Okay. So my name is Susan Brownlow, and I am a freelance PR consultant, really sort of focused on media relations. I also write articles and bylines and op-eds, and I deal with all areas of the media, broadcast, broadsheet, trade, podcasts, interviews, all that sort of thing.
So we go next. Jonathan, go on.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Right. Hi, John. I'm founded the Tilton Consultancy about a year ago, probably an outfit that couldn't probably pre-exist in COVID, because we are pretty much entirely virtual, with colleagues currently working by choice in anywhere from Senegal to Madeira to the south of England and wherever they are. Essentially focused on reputation and risk strategies, very focused obviously therefore on ESG and where that fits within corporate issues. And we work with a wide range of organizations, including Unilever's tea business, the biggest in the world, with UPM, which is breakthrough in biochemicals and tech and all sorts of different sectors. So this topic obviously is core to our agenda, and happy to provide whatever tips and guidance. A former chair of the PRCA Council, and in-house with Coca-Cola and others, and way back when a newspaper journalist, the Mirror and Daily.
Brilliant, thanks. Caroline.
Hi, I'm Caroline Randle. I'm Head of Communications for the Energy Transitions Commission, which is a global coalition of leaders from across the energy landscape, including energy providers, corporates, NGOs, civil society and academia. Prior to that, I worked in consultancy and also as a freelancer as well. And some of the companies I worked for included Microsoft, General Electric, as well as public sector and NGOs.
Brilliant. Thanks, guys. So yes, let's kick off, because as I said, we've got a lot to cover. So the first sort of question I wanted to ask you guys is a bit broad, but how has sustainability and the idea of what sustainability is, how has that changed over the last few years, would you say?
Well, I think it's changed hugely. Really from being something that's the right thing to do to becoming part of an explicit part of the business plan. And I think it's moved from, a few years ago, really focusing on CO2 emissions, which of course is fundamental today as well, but it's expanded hugely through to carbon capture. So for example, I'm working on a big campaign at the moment for planting trees, which they regard as probably the only immediate sort of scalable option, for negative, carbon emissions. Through to biodiversity, soil regeneration, farming regeneration. So it's really sort of gone from end to end, and also it's gone right through the value chain as well. So rather than an organization or a commercial organization or the public sector just being responsible for themselves, they are driving it right through from end to end.
Definitely. Jonathan, Caroline, which one of you wants to go next?
Caroline, why don't you go?
Go on.
Yeah, it's definitely changed. When I was reflecting and thinking about this session as well, I started looking at when we'd first seen references of sustainability, and I think you have to go back to the UN in 1987. And I think their definition then, which probably still holds true, but in maybe in a different way, is it meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So I think that was obviously fairly insightful at the time, but definitely I think as it was seen as very much a sort of niche, an add-on, and even if we went back as sort of 10 years ago, a lot of the programs to do with environment, or whether they were called CSR, was something that were very much adjacent to the core business. I think you could discuss different definitions of sustainability, and they'll probably mean different things to different organisations. But as Susan reflected, I think it's very much central to an organisation, and I think an organisation needs to look at it as part of its business. It's certainly, I think the days when it's an add-on are long gone, thankfully.
From my point of view, I'd probably stretch it further. I think that organisations, communities have obviously had to, have always had to consider sustainability in some shape or form, in the broadest sense, whether that's the ability to attract workers to the mill towns in the north or the coal mines in Nottinghamshire, like my family moved there in the 1800s, attracted by, better welfare, from digging holes in Derbyshire. And you think about that more in terms of enlightened self-interest of commercial enterprises who were having to put in welfare or clean up, the environment because it was unacceptable. So I think we're always in a kind of tension point between what's acceptable and not acceptable, and therefore the band of when we talk about any of these agendas is quite wide, So and it's a real mistake, I would say, to think of it as one thing. It's always a span. I mean, if you just to take one topical subject. So only last week, I think the Ofwat, criticised a damning report on the water companies for failing to deliver on clean water, putting sewage in the rivers. And you think, well, isn't clean water a right, a human right today for people in the UK? Well, apparently it isn't. We can discuss why separately, but that's going backwards. It's not going forwards. I mean, that's a real degradation. I mean, in 1856, those of you remember it, the Great Stink. Right? It's great to look at this. The Great Stink was so bad because people were using the Thames as a sewer for reasons of earlier regulation, that Parliament couldn't sit in Westminster anymore. They couldn't stand it. And they brought legislation in to create the sewers that we're still using today in 18 days, a record decision. And they put the tax bill on Londoners for 40 years to pay for those sewers, which we still do. And they were so good, they've lasted all this time. So it's quite incredible that, a law in 1858 was just so bad. And then we found the means and the method, and the public purse paid for it, of course, to actually affect change. And now actually we're going backwards, you could argue, at this very moment in time on that very issue. So these things are much longer threads than that, and they have much deeper and longer threads. And economically and socially, therefore, you really have to look at it quite in a broad span, I would argue. But that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't. Everyone has to act and do things. It's just that you need to see it in a much broader span.
Definitely.
One of the things I was going to add, actually, I don't know whether everybody else has seen it, but there are some sort of real sort of watershed moments sort of starting to happen in terms of accountability. I mean, yesterday a judge ruled that the government was not living up to it, well, was actually in breach of its obligations in the Climate Act. So because they were not providing a detailed sort of pathway as to how you get to net zero. So they have this sort of broad strategy. So, a judge has actually, brought the government to book in terms of not doing enough. And this is sort of this is quite a long time after we started talking about net zero. And, there's a real sort of David and Goliath moment happening as well, as a Peruvian farmer that is suing Germany's largest utility companies. And that could be a landmark case. Now, the interesting thing is that, RWE, who is the utility company, I mean, it's one of the dirtiest companies in Europe, but they've never operated in South America. They've certainly never operated in Peru. Yet this landmark case is being held because their emissions and everything is affecting the world globally. In Peru as much as it is in Germany. So I think, again, when we're talking about sustainability and how it's changed, I think there's a real acceleration in terms of holding organizations to account.
Definitely. And in terms of that sort of holding them to account, as you just said, there was that case with the judge. I'd be interested to sort of hear from you, Susan, from a sort of media perspective. How does that sort of play into things in terms of the media holding people to account? I know that you sort of mentioned when we sort of were discussing this last week, how you've seen a huge sort of change in how many topics will now come under that phrase, you know, sustainability in sort of recent years.
Yeah. I'm not quite sure what the angle of your question was, but are you saying how do we present our story in case to I think really with clients, I really like to road test their proposition and ask a lot of questions and go into the substantiation. I do that on a professional and personal level, and I would not pitch to any journalists that I didn't think the story was going to stack up. And I think particularly in the broadsheet media and actually also in many of the trade, the energy trades, for example, these individuals are very incisive and they really know their stuff. So you've got to be able to talk not only knowledgeably, but you've got to be able to back up what you say. And they will sniff out any element of greenwashing whatsoever. So it's really a case of from my perspective, I only really work with clients that I know, that they aren't involved in greenwashing, and that can tell their story honestly and genuinely.
Brilliant. And in terms of sort of then telling that story, I suppose what I'd be interested to sort of hear from you guys is, there are different audiences, I suppose, for this topic. Everybody sort of thinks of sustainability in their own way, reacts to, the idea of sustainability in their own way. How would you sort of identify and differentiate your audience? And then how would you sort of communicate to those audiences differently?
Well, I have an interesting perspective on it because quite often I'm presented with a news story or a press release from a client. And it may be obvious to them, or what they think is obvious, that one audience might be relevant, but there could be multiple audiences. And the way that you approach producers or editors or whatever can be quite different. An example might be I'm regularly pitching to Sky on a story, but how I might pitch to the producer of Ian King Live could be very different, would be very different to how I pitch to the Daily Climate Show, which is a bit more of a consumer-based, program. So you could actually be telling fundamentally the same story, but the way that you're framing it could be different. So sort of similar outcomes, but different approach.
Yeah, I think it's going back to those sort of first principles as a comms professional, really, about understanding who your target audience is and tailoring the message accordingly. At the Energy Transitions Commission, we provide an evidence-based approach, but we target multiple audiences. So we produce our analytical team produce 100-page plus reports on particular aspects of the technology and what we need to do to sort of get to those net zero targets. And then we produce other content that goes alongside that, whether that's a press release or an executive summary or explainers or infographics or video as well, and all really have their place. And I think it's important to remember sometimes that, we have to have a duty to sort of explain it in the way that will sort of get through and put it in a broader context as well, and help people understand not just the here and now, but the journey. Sometimes when we talk about 2050 targets, that can seem quite abstract, but try and bring that to life and give examples of people working and tell their stories as well. What are the challenges? What are the things that are going well? What's going to happen next? And really try and paint a picture to bring that to life, and also act to correct some of the misinformation that's around out there as well, that quickly seems to gain credence and have its own narrative, which can quite quickly spin out of control as well.
One other point, I was just sorry, John, go ahead.
Sure, I was going to just say that obviously we're thinking about it largely in a positive sense, and obviously depending on which organisation you're working for or representing, it depends very much what your objective is. So if you're trying to stall progress or mitigate against things that you're doing not particularly well, then that's obviously a different agenda completely. Just to make the point again of that span of you can't assume everyone's all got good intentions. I think what also I would say is that clearly, depending on what the organisation wants to achieve, certainly from my point of view, a lot of the work is to build potentially alliances, collaborations, commercial partners. So to explain the technology, explain the benefit, explain why this is going to be different, and you've got to sell that to a potentially quite a broad technical audience, and at the same time regulators and policymakers that we are doing the right thing. This is going to be a positive for the environment, a positive for the region, and things like this. So it's very centric to it's obviously centric to the organisation you're representing. So I would always encourage everyone to think about, okay, what is my role here? How do I fit within the dialogue? If I'm legal and I'm already passing the basic tests, then great. But even then, what actually is going to move the dial commercially or reputationally or from a policy point of view to achieve commercial goals? Obviously, if you're in a business that's actually driving change, fantastic. It's the message is the execution. You don't even have to argue between what sustainability. It's like, we are going to solve net zero by helping 10,000 companies reduce their waste, like Solaris, my German client. So it very much depends on where you start from.
And one of the points I was just going to make is that I've always really regarded myself as having two audiences. There are the end viewers or readers, but the editor or the journalist, the producer, whatever they might be, they're not just the conduit to getting to those people. They are actually an audience in their own right. And I think it's very important to get to know them and understand their areas of interest and expertise, and perhaps what they don't know about. So I'm constantly speaking with them. I'm also constantly looking and keeping up to date on what they're writing about, or what they're reporting, or perhaps what they haven't been writing about that they ought to know about. So I very much approach them, as an individual and as an audience in their own right.
Caroline, you mentioned misinformation there. So I just wanted to sort of ask, what would you guys say is sort of the most sort of harmful, I suppose, misinformation that's going around there, and how can we sort of try and combat that as in the comms world?
There's a lot of, well, it's question, there's a lot of misinformation going on at the moment. So I guess if you look at the current sort of news agenda in the UK around the Tory elections, it's interesting to see what the responses have been to sort of discussions about net zero. So I think, and some of the claims in terms of the current energy crisis as well, that it's down to the accelerated pace of the energy transition. So we would there's evidence to counter that as well. So I guess those are two that would spring to mind as well. And how to correct it, I think it's just by continuing to explain. For us at the ETC, it's to give that fact-based perspective, and we don't have our agenda is really to provide information. So we hope that we can counter those arguments. And I guess sometimes it's the nature of press as well, that they like to have that polarized view and a debate, and we try and have that sort of middle path, really, which hopefully helps people either make decisions or helps people understand the current context that we're in as well. But I think all organisations, it goes back to transparency and making it sort of clear what you're doing, what's correct, and if there's misinformation out there, trying to correct it in the best way that you can.
Anyone else have anything to add to that, or shall we?
Only I think a health check again to remember that not everyone thinks the same. Looking at some stats on people who believe climate change is real and impacting their country, it's gone up from about 50% in most countries 2013, typically into the 80s, 70s, 80s now. So that's still a lot of people who don't believe it's real. So, and there's an awful lot of politicians that don't believe it's real, right? So and even media who would, are quite skeptical. So Again, that I would really encourage us to think about. Everyone, you need to understand where people start from. You know, it's a personal thing. I mean, we can't force people to believe in things. They have to, you know, and if they're in the, and it's a question of whether you need to win them over or not. Are they in the way, or can you just press on and try and achieve change without consensus? That's ultimately what has to happen, frankly. I don't think we can achieve through consensus. We'll be too slow. So you know, you're going to either have leading tech which will change things, or very enlightened, you know, government decisions that will be painful for people to make because it will cost and want to move faster. That's just basic stuff. That's not a political view. It's just, I think, a reality. If you believe that we have a climate crisis, then there's only two or three ways you can change, and you know, that's it.
Yeah, I think another point, I guess it's an adjacent point really, is that yes, it is a global issue as well, and for a lot of organisations, the situation, you know, in London will be different to Brussels, to, you know, India, to China, to North America, South America. So particularly for people working with global clients and global organisations, I think that's a factor as well. So and again, it's trying to keep that balance of what works at that sort of local basis, but also balancing it with global discussions as well. So I think for people working in that area, that's something that I'm sure takes up a lot of their time and attention as well.
All right. So I'm going to move us on slightly to another broad, big question. ESG and CSR, how are they different? And what is, you know, how has CSR changed? Is it still relevant? Nice small question.
Just again, back to that framework of, I think, philanthropy, enlightened self-interest, I think is still a good thing. You know, you figure out that you know, unless I change things around me, I'm not going to progress. I haven't got the workers, I can't attract talent. You know, no one's going to come here. So enlightened self-interest is still a good thing, and that's goes way back when. So philanthropy was, we can do bad things and we can give money away. So you know, we can run the slave trade and spend it on schools and universities, and obviously that's a topic we're still debating today. But that was it. So philanthropy, bad things. Social responsibility is kind of a successor of that, really, with philanthropy, I would argue. So looking at it more holistically, you know, how can we give back? You know, there was often the phrase you hear, morphing into somewhere along the way into the broader sustainability idea as the environment became more prominent in the 90s. And then the ESG agenda really was broadening it out again, environment, social and governance, which was really a governance framework, really not an impact framework. And that's why people are criticizing it now. It isn't a very precise metric for impact. And then moving on out of that into what will be people more talk about, which is impact assessment, impact accounting, impact investment, and so on, as we move more to actually looking at the true impact of an organization's behavior on society and the environment. So that's a quick fly through.
That's helpful. That's helpful. And so, yeah, so I suppose CSR, ESG, they are, you know, do people, I mean, in the past, marketers and communication professionals have been sort of, I suppose, accused of overusing ESG. Would you guys agree with that? It's being a little bit sort of overused.
I think there can be a tendency with marketeers, and I hate to say it, to perhaps overuse things, or things become particularly popular at particular times. Normally it's cyclical and you find the same things coming around. I'm agreeing with what Jonathan says, but being called something else actually. So CSR had many iterations, and he's right, it does go back to those sort of days of philanthropy, and Joseph Ramsey would be another example of that as well. There was a time, I don't hear the phrase so much, but I guess in the last sort of 5, 6, 7 years ago, we heard a lot of businesses talk about doing well by doing good. So I guess that would be another evolution of that as well. So I think it's just how it's packaged, but it brings you back to, and I guess, you know, whether it's called CSR or ESG, if it achieves the sort of objectives and gets organisations to look at how they're operating in a socially responsible way that takes in environment, economic factors, and social factors as well, that's for good. I'm not a financial comms specialist, so I think if you look at that area in terms of ethical investing, that is a big question as well, and I'm sure they'd have probably a much more considered point of view on ESG, but definitely that is a factor, and ethical investing and the sort of rise of a group sort of looking at investments and really putting them under the microscope as well has definitely been a feature of the last few years. And I guess on balance, it would, I don't know if others would agree, but it's probably more of a force for good than a force for bad over time.
Do you guys agree with that? Would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Good stuff.
I think the point about the misuse, which is worth visiting. I mean, what again, a big caution to everyone, on this. It's not, ESG is not a thing like let's have an ESG this or an ESG that. It's a framework through which you view things, and there is a tendency, we're always a tendency for people to coin an idea and then we market the hell out of it and we got it, and it gets aggregated in different ways, which are quite inappropriate. That's all. I mean, I totally agree that doing the right thing, do well by do good by doing well, etc. Any combination of understanding my impact on society, environment, and can I do well by doing better, is a fundamentally good idea, clearly. But what does happen is obviously mini industries occur, around all these topics, with brands and companies even called those things, which obviously then defend them like death, because they, if it goes out of fashion, they go out of fashion. So, that in our industry, I'm talking about, not more broadly. So that's a risk, and it's a problem in our industry when people start defending things which are really have been designed to try and make money as a short-term goal.
Mm-hmm. And so you guys mentioned, oh, sorry, Caroline, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to say, a lot of, as we've seen, particularly over the last year, 18 months, and coming out of COP26, a lot of organisations have set targets to do with 2050, 2030 as well. So that's back to the points that Jonathan and Susan were making in terms of impact. So there is work being done, and there are lots of different ways that you can measure that impact. I think I mentioned it earlier, but I think one thing that I really do think important is having small benchmarks along the way, as well, and measuring the success and progress. I think we're probably all agreed on the need to sort of accelerate progress, but what does that progress look like, and really communicating the journey and what needs to be done by whom, and trying to make it as clear as possible. I think perhaps in the past, some of the communications around sustainability was quite abstract. That may not be the case now, particularly when we look outside at the extreme weather event. I guess that can bring things home to us. But also, I think that the ways in which we communicate have evolved to much more about the here and now and the tangible, and particularly as sort of backlash from some of the potential greenwashing or people's perceptions of what greenwashing might have been, sort of if we went back sort of 10 years ago.
That actually does lead me on to my next point so nicely, about greenwashing. So yeah, I suppose, how would you identify greenwashing? I know that, Susan, you mentioned that you don't really work with clients that could be greenwashing. How would you sort of identify that that's what it is that they're doing?
One of the things that tends to put me on high alert, and it might be unfair, but I always get a little sort of worried when an organization tells me that sustainability is in their DNA. That is something that is constantly sort of rolled out. And to be honest, there's only about 400 or 500 B certified corporations in the UK. Those are the ones that can say they have sort of, sustainability in their DNA. And we have an awful lot more than 500 companies in the UK. So that sort of puts me on high alert, because I think it's just trotted out. So that's one thing. And the other point I'd like to make from my perspective is, I sometimes think it's quite unfair, though, with some organizations when they undertake offsetting, that they're told that this is greenwashing. I mean, I think if a company uses verified, certifiable offset programs to use when they have done everything else, and operationally they can't reduce their emissions anymore, or at least not at this stage. And there are lots of industries, you know, aviation, of course, shipping, chemicals. There are lots of organizations that can do as much as they can, and at this stage they're still, you know, they're sort of stuck until the technology is scalable. So I think sometimes if there are sort of certified and verifiable offset programs, they can be valuable in the interim. So that was just a point I'd make. I think a lot of that, I think some offsetting gets a bit of a bad rap sometimes.
Well, there's plenty of current examples. I mean, the Advertising Standards Agency, obviously, have recently geared up on that one. Tesco have been pulled in. There's been a whole variety of different brands have been pulled out. The claims, there's other things happening in other countries. KLM have come in for a lot of fire in the Netherlands recently over their claims. So it's tightening, you know, it's tightening, and more dramatically, there was a story about a month ago when a division of Deutsche Bank was raided by 40 policemen over greenwashing claims. It was actually financial mis-selling, which is why 40 cops turned up. But nevertheless, 40 policemen over greenwashing. Well, this is getting serious, and because they were basically they were assigning certain funds in their ESG fund which weren't really sustainable funds. So that's how they were caught. And the reason they got caught out was because the chief sustainability officer, who they obviously didn't treat well, blew the whistle on them. So, you know, I think we saw that recently with Uber as well. Obviously, the chief public affairs guy blowing the whistle on Uber for their social behavior. So I think we can see a lot more of that coming on. All our colleagues who are doing this good job in trying to keep the company to account and now turning tail and blowing it out. So another reason to be thinking about how you handle your own employee relations.
I think we've been talking about sort of use of terminology. I suspect that greenwashing is another of those that, again, is an umbrella term for lots of things as well. Susan brought in that point about offsets, and sometimes people sort of jump on particular things and just almost hear the headline, and it can get lumped into greenwashing, whether that's the case or not. I think as Jonathan says, there have been cases of that, and certainly I hadn't heard of the Peruvian example that Susan had given, but certainly in the Netherlands there are examples as well of companies being held to account, the airline being held to account as well at the moment. Looking at it from a sort of, I wouldn't class myself as a brand marketeer, but if you're looking at it from that side of things, those organisations that set themselves up as ethical brands, I think for them the scrutiny will be more intense, and I guess a lot of brands are trying to promote a lifestyle around that sort of ethical living. It's a bit like Susan was saying about if a company says sustainability is my DNA, it immediately makes you think, oh, okay. So I think if you're putting yourself on a platform, particularly in some markets, people are going to look at your claims and look at the small print a bit more closely. So I think it's just that good responsible business practice. If you're claiming something, make sure that you can back it up as well. I mean, it's a bit like, you know, 10, 15, 20 years ago when people say we've got the best customer service and we've won all these awards, it's great, but if you can't get through to someone on the phone, not quite so convincing. So I guess a similar applies in this area as well, and certainly people have seen a market for ethical goods and services as well. So I think that's something just to be aware of as well.
Definitely. And so I suppose then, if you are, you know, part of business or an organization and that accusation comes in, greenwashing is used from a sort of, I'd be interested, sort of media crisis comms perspective, what would be your advice, sort of, I suppose, first steps and overall sort of, you know, ways to fix that? Just to kick off.
My gut feeling is it will take you time to recover from that. So if, you know, the Guardian, the Telegraph, or wherever it might be, you know, calls you out on greenwashing, I don't think you can expect whatever you're going to do in the next few weeks is going to sort of turn that around. So I think you have to be you have to have sort of reasonable expectations. My feeling would be that you have to accept it, own it, have the responsibility for it, do something about it, go back to the journalists and sort of rebrief them at a later stage, but be prepared for really rigorous questioning at that point. But I do think you have to have the ownership, and I think you need to, depending on what the story was, you know, you need to apologize for it and be very clear and give detailed, you know, what you're going to do to make things better. But it will take time.
Well, prevention better than cure, right? I mean, Diageo announced a couple of weeks ago that they were training 1,200 marketeers on the pitfalls of greenwashing and sustainability claims to make sure that across the organisation they build a deeper possible understanding of what this is all about, because that's, you know, those 1,200 people is exactly where the problems are going to happen. Someone's doing something crazy in a market that's just not through, and they're absolutely right to take that initiative, and I'm sure others will and are.
Yeah, I would agree as well with both Susan and Jonathan on both those points in terms of taking responsibility and finding out and addressing it on a fact-based perspective, but definitely in terms of, you know, setting up organisations to be looking at these issues, so it hopefully doesn't get to that stage as well. I mean, some of the consumer brands, Diageo, PepsiCo, and others are doing a lot of really good work, you know, and looking at things. We haven't talked so much about things like, you know, how water's being used. So for every packet of crisps they produce and the potatoes required, they've really done some cutting edge work in terms of water reduction, in terms of some of those food processing aspects of things. So there is a lot of good work that those companies have done, and I have done some work with them in the past myself, but I think they do a fairly good job on showcasing that as well. But it's always, you know, that sometimes gets forgotten if there's an issue or a crisis as well. Tone is also a really important thing in this area as well, the tone of communication. And I think that's from the start of when you communicate. It's back to Susan's comment about the DNA. But when you have an issue or crisis, tone is even more important as well. So that's another thing to consider.
Definitely. So we're nearly at question time, but just sort of one more thing, I suppose. Sort of, Jonathan, you mentioned how, you know, people are bringing in more, you know, ethically conscious people. They're bringing in sustainability advisors, and then that's sometimes backfiring, and they sort of become a bit of a whistleblower. Do you think that could potentially have a negative effect on people bringing in those, you know, those ethically conscious people?
Question. Unethical companies may find that a problem. You're right. Yeah. I mean, that's not a good idea, is it? To bring in but there's a whole series of these. I mean, they're quite remarkable appointments that get made just before the house crashes. You know, as a kind of, right, we've got this person now, we're going to be fine. So that's one extreme. I think it's really, really interesting. I mean, because if you make the reasonable assumption that more and more of your employees are, as the Daily Telegraph would call them, the woke net zero brigade, their words, not mine. In other words, they actually believe climate crisis is real and they want to do something about it. That's what they mean, translated. So more and more of your employees and senior employees believe in certain things. Of course, you know, it's going to be a crisis of conscience, right? So the answer is pretty clear. You know, be the organisation you desire to be, and allow people to. You want to bring people in who challenge and change and innovate, right? So I think. But I think it's fascinating that the backfire is happening, because in many cases the very people who were hired because of their skills and knowledge were presumably rejected inside that outfit, and therefore feel the need to go and, you know, and blow it up. Well, not unreasonably, I suppose.
Yeah, that actually, we'll come to questions properly in a minute, but that plays into a question that we
Sorry,
had.
whistleblowers, I'm just saying.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like,
It plays into a question that we had from Paul, and he said, you know, we've talked a lot about environmental sustainability, the E of ESG, but less actually in terms of sort of people sustainability, so the S. You know, what are companies doing to recruit and retain great people, and what are the key trends there?
Well, I think you're right about the environment we have. It has dominated the conversation a bit, and that was clearly something we should always try and correct, because the social aspect is absolutely vital. I mean, it's a broad subject. I mean, you know, but I mean, I think that what I see is the recognition that, you know, if you don't have this clear, if you don't have this agenda right, and I'm talking now to people like fast-growing tech companies or you know, consumer businesses, you're not going to get them. So it's binary in that sense. But others may have a more direct.
Yeah, I agree with that as well. I guess people have different expectations coming into the workforce in terms of people that they're working for, and they expect them to behave in a responsible manner. And then also, I think there's that responsibility beyond your immediate employees as well, which would be a whole different discussion in terms of supply chain as well, and the responsibility organisations have, whether big or small, to be looking at who they're doing business with and where they're doing business and what type of business is as well. So all those things need to be considered. If you're a small business, it's easier, you know everyone. If you're a large corporate, it's always going to be more challenging. But I guess that goes back to the G bit, the governance.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks for mentioning that one.
That's an interesting point. That sort of supply chain and that corporate journey, I suppose. How would you guys sort of say that that's been playing into the wider sort of conversation? You know, do you think that people are becoming more conscious of who they're working with on a business basis?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. Sorry, John.
Go ahead.
I did some work last year for an organization that was trying to better the livelihoods of the miners in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the cobalt miners. And one of the things they were doing was sort of really driving home to the end users. So people with sort of, you know, the mobile phone manufacturers, the Teslas of this world, et cetera, the electrical vehicles, you know, of the appalling conditions these people sort of live under. And they are affecting change, but it is taking time. But they are, you know, I think end users of, you know, products, natural products are starting to realize what the impact is, you know, on the ground.
Does anyone else want to jump in with that? Should we move on? It's actually probably nearly time for questions, actually. So we've got a question here that says, how do you measure the impact of communications?
How long we got?
We've got 15 minutes.
I'll pass.
Caroline, Susan, does anyone, either of you want to take that one?
Again, it's back to looking at what you as an organisation want to achieve in the first instance, making sure you're really clear on what the objectives are and what success looks like, and success may look like different things for different organisations at different times as well. So I guess and it's really then back to impact as well. And I think sometimes as communications professionals, we measure in lots of different ways. So your immediate goal might be, oh, I want to get this story placed in the Financial Times. But actually, very often, a lot of the work is done behind the scenes in terms of getting coalitions to work, getting businesses together to sort of drive that impact. So I think it's different ways, I think. And I think we probably have to do a combination of those as well. It's those short-term comms goals, but making sure that they really fit into the longer-term goals of an organisation, so that you can show delivering impact as well, and try and keep it focused. You can and different things work for different organisations as well. And you also have to have the balance right between activity and measurement as well. So I hope that helps. But as John said, it's a big subject, but hopefully that gives some guidance. And those are the principles that I try and use when I'm looking at comms work.
Susan, did you want to add anything?
I think from a media relations point of view, I think when you develop a relationship with a journalist based on the stories that you're giving them and the information that you're giving them, when it starts to become a two-way street, so that you are not always pushing out, but they are coming to you because of the clients that you represent and the stories that are relevant to them. I think that that is a measurement of success as well, that they, you know, you have this relationship and they trust you and they trust the client that you're representing. So that is a big point of impact for me.
Brilliant. We've got another question as well, saying, does the panel have any recommendations for a comms, public affairs professional who would like to develop more experience in ESG comms?
I'll give it a quick one. I mean, I think if it's not available within your immediate sphere, obviously, which is if you're working for a corporation or an agency, then hopefully there are opportunities. But I'm assuming the question suggests that's limited. So how do we get out of that? One obvious way is to look at the third sector. There's loads of organisations that would love your help if you're a commerce professional who are dealing with these agendas, and just actually being, immersed in the challenges would already be a good thing. And there's different gateways to that. There's different organisations that we're happily to do, provide some information on that you could get to that point. One thing that we champion for this very reason is we do a partnership with Central St Martin and the University of Arts London. We've got a fantastic, it's an incredible range of different interventions in that space, from the built environment to biochemistry to, everything you can imagine, including narrative and innovation. And so we collaborate with them to really open our brains up, to the potential of different things that are going on, and then bring clients in and make that a real kind of laboratory. So that would suggest, therefore, that there's probably also opportunities to look, wherever you are, at the academic route, to collaborate and look at things. I just think it's there. It's a question of getting out the door and being able to do it. But I'd happily provide some advice on that separately.
Another question. So they've said in many large organizations, the sustainability team is responsible for driving those ESG programs. Could you guys think of some areas that the comms sort of team can help, with better decision making with regards to ESG?
I would encourage people to be connected with, as many parts of the organisation as they can. The sustainability, normally where it works well, the comms team are embedded throughout the business, whether that's sustainability or investor relations, and have at the highest level, that comms team should have that route into the board and be actively involved in the business strategy of an organisation, no matter how large or small. So success really lies in being connected, being integrated as an organisation and working together, not seeing things as an add-on. Now, some organisations, I appreciate, may be easier to do that rather than others, but that is the discussion that that needs to be had, and push for that, really.
Definitely. And one of the other questions we've got, the question thing is, sustainability is worldwide. So when talking about communication, how can we reach out to various audiences in a clear way if you're sort of doing it on a global scale, I suppose?
So I didn't quite catch that. That was how do you reach out to auditors?
So no, so we're talking about
audiences.
Audiences.
Sorry.
Audiences in a clear way. It's obviously sustainability is a worldwide sort of issue.
I think Susan touched on it earlier. Well, both my colleagues did. But it really comes down to being absolutely clear about who you want to persuade about what. I think starting anything with a broad attempt to talk about sustainability is probably not a good place to start. It's really figuring out what it is the organisation needs to achieve and what you want people to do. Do you want them to collaborate? Do you want them to change policies? Do you want them to invest? Do you want whatever it is? Because those people, guarantee, are going to have quite different perspectives, starting perspectives to where yours is. So if you don't, to Susan's point about media, if you don't understand that in every sector, in every stakeholder, then you're going to have a difficult job. And that really in this space, because we tend to assume everyone thinks the same and they really don't.
Yeah. No, and yeah, exactly. They don't think the same because they've got a different experience. So I think even with global organizations, they're very much looking at how does that work for them? How do they operate on the ground? It varies, you know, country to country, never mind region to region as well. So I would say work with your local teams, whether they're people that are directly part of the organisation or through third parties, partners or agencies as well, and really take the advice of the people on the ground. Don't come in and think you can impose a sort of one size fits all rule to what you're trying to achieve as well. And listen, you know, very much good communication starts with good listening as well. So listen, assess, plan, and all those sorts of things that you would do as part of a communications program, and then go from there as well.
We've got Susan, did you have anything to add to that? Sorry.
Yeah, I was just about to say, I have worked with organizations before that said, you know, we have one message and we have one press release, and this is what we're sticking to, and we're not deviating from it at all. And I can see how it's going to fit, you know, with my pitches to the media in certain areas, but I just know that it's going to fall on stony ground with many others. So I know a lot of PR practitioners say, you know, don't want to adapt messaging or adapt a press release or whatever it might be. I am an advocate of adapting things for the audience, geographically, you know, by sector, you know, whoever they are, sort of thing. So I think, again, it's really, you know, speaking, as Caroline said, it's not one size that fits all.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, sometimes that there is an element of pragmatism there as well. For some people, it's just easier to do one press release, but then realise that what you put around that needs to vary, and you need to be taking advice. And or if you don't have that advice on the ground, to sort of look at what the landscape is in that area that you're trying to target as well, and be sensitive. Sometimes it's difficult if you're not in the country yourself to appreciate the nuances of each situation of markets and the geopolitics as well. So, but I do think you have to try and be mindful of that as well. Or maybe, you know, it's not the right time to communicate somewhere on a particular issue as well. Sometimes it's about that too.
And we've got sort of time probably, I think, for one last question. So how could, you know, an organisation sort of engage that audience and community in sustainable activations and help sort of raise awareness of the topic?
I'll happily kick it off if you like. I mean, I work with the Forest Stewardship Council, and one of the things we always implore them to say is, when they're talking about the technical nature of how we're going to, you know, hectares and regenerate, take us to the forest, show it, make it real, show us the smells, the colors, the experiences, why it matters, make it real. So in any situation, an activation that brings people to the solution and the challenge in a real and an immersive and relevant way is vital. So but if it's about communities, you know, what are the kind of partnerships and collaborations that you could look at, local groups that are trying to achieve things, there's lots of them that you could involve, you know, and collaborate with to really generate buy-in and get people experiencing. The experience, I think, is so vital with these things. I mean, people's minds change when they have experiences and they really understand it. Maybe people will change their minds over the last couple of days about. I was going to say,
maybe the 41 degrees might.
Maybe not. Maybe.
I would add to that. Just people, you know, it's about explaining it to people, giving them the facts, but then, as John has said, showing them and showing them examples as well. And I think that's a much more powerful way. You know, it's back to storytelling. People understand by the stories we tell. So the same needs to be applied here, and very much that sort of visual storytelling, taking someone there. If you can't take them, show them what's happening, and back it up with sort of, you know, facts that are quite difficult to challenge because they are based on the best evidence around at the moment as well. So really that story-based approach, and try and give a positive message, what needs to be done to make this happen as well, and try and keep it succinct. I think sometimes we can all guilty of over communicating and saying too many things. So I think that's how I try and best approach things.
And I'm really conscious of time, but there's one more question, so I might come to each of you. Who are the best journalists or thought leaders to watch and follow on the topic of ESG, would you say, at the moment?
I think Susan does that.
ESG, gosh, do you want to give you a list?
Yeah. Do you know what? We can send around a list afterwards if it's easier.
I'd be happy to put a list of a dozen people together and send that to you, Olivia.
Yeah. Well, what we'll do after this, as I said, it's 4 minutes to 1, so I'll wrap things up now. Guys, it's been a super interesting discussion. Thank you all so much for speaking on this important topic. We'll send around a recording of this webinar to everyone afterwards with that list and any other questions that we might have missed. So do pop anything else in the chat. And we can always get that answered for you after this. Thanks so much to everyone who's joined on this beautiful hot day. And yeah, I hope everyone manages to keep cool and take care. Have a wonderful rest of your week, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks,
Everyone,
guys.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.